Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Karl Rove, former senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007, and Deputy Chief of Staff from 2004 to 2007, where he oversaw the offices of Strategic Initiatives, Political Affairs, Public Liaison, and Intergovernmental Affairs, as well as coordinated the White House policymaking process. Before Mr. Rove became known as the architect of President Bush's 2000 and 2004 campaigns, he was president of Karl Rove and Company, an Austin-based public affairs firm that advised over 75 Republican U.S. Senate, congressional, and gubernatorial candidates in 24 states, as well as the moderate party of Sweden. In the past 10 years, Mr. Rove has delivered remarks and joined in conversation at the Reagan Library multiple times, and we're honored to have him join us now virtually. During today's conversation, Mr. Rove discusses how he got involved in Swedish politics, his read on President Donald Trump, and the 2020 presidential election. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program with Karl Rove and Reagan Institute Director Roger Zakheim.
Karl Rove, welcome to Reaganism Podcast. It's wonderful to have you here.
Good to be here.
You're a great supporter of the Reagan Foundation. We love having you at the Reagan National Defense
Fund.
Fund.
For money again?
We get it all.
Yeah.
No good deed goes unpunished. Of course, you're most well known for your role in President George W. Bush's administration, overseeing presidential campaigns, ensuring that he was elected and reelected. Some don't know the other type of work you do. One that got our attention is you actually involve yourself in Swedish politics as well.
Which is very strange because I'm Norwegian American. As you know, there's a little bit of
Yes.
When I was a college Republican national chairman in my early 20s, the college Republicans were part of an international group of center-right student groups, primarily in Europe. And I went to a conference in Helsinki, and it was the British conservatives and the French Gaullists and the CDU, CSU from Germany. And it was the Swedes were there as well, who were vehemently anti-communist. And they were led by a young college student who later became the leader of the Moderata Party, the moderate party, which are the conservatives.
Which conservatives in Europe.
Yeah, moderate party. And they weren't very moderate when it came to the Soviets. I mean, they made us...
Well, geography has something to do with it, right?
Yeah. In fact, so my friend got me involved in helping their party getting ready to do an election in the early 90s, and they wanted to build up their mail list. And so I had a direct mail company, so they hired me to come over and help them. Walked into the headquarters, which is right near the Inner Harbor, and they showed me their facility, and they had a computer room where they had their hard drive, which back then looked sort of like washing machines. And they had above the hard drive, they had a fire axe with a sign saying, "When the Soviets invade, destroy the hard drive." And I said, "That's a very funny joke." They said, "We are very serious. They're going to be coming for the list of conservative party members to send to the re-education camps." So my friend became the first non-socialist prime minister of Sweden in 40 years.
So he succeeded?
Carl Bildt. Yes.
Karl Bildt, well, I know Karl Bildt well, and he's one of the kind of most prominent thinkers in foreign policy in Europe. Let's bring it back to the U.S. Obviously, people see you on Fox News, read what you write in the Wall Street Journal, but there's also been media reporting that you have stood vines, and even President Trump, both in 2016 and for his reelect. What kind of advice are you giving the president these days on the reelect?
Well, look, I love how the media blows it up. I met Brad Parscale a couple years ago, and I like the guy. I think he's a good man. I think he's trying to do the right thing for the guy that he cares about deeply and is doing it the right way. But I want of us expect a long list of people So I'm not advising when I'm answering the phone as a courtesy, giving my candidate advice, because, it's worth exactly what he paid for it.
What, he watches Fox News,
Well,
and so he sees that advice there as well.
Yeah, he reads the column, and occasionally he'll call and say, tell me more about what you said about X, and I'm happy to, give him, further exploration of what. But the idea that if I'm advising the Trump campaign, that I'm advising about 40% of the campaigns in America, I'll get calls out of the blue from candidates saying, can you spend 15 or 20 minutes with me, and I want to ask you some questions. Mainly the next thing that they ask is, can you send me some money?
Well, that's the prerogative of the politician seeking elective office. Now, you also wrote a book about President McKinley. Not exactly the first president you would think might come to mind for a presidential historian. How much of the work you done at McKinley informs advice you give or your thinking on presidential campaigns?
Well, it's funny. We studied the election of 1896. It's one of the 5 great realigning elections. The 1800, 1828, 1860, 1896, 1932. American politics is one way before that election and dramatically different after. And what's interesting is we study 4 of the 5 elections by studying the person who won it. Jefferson in 1800, Jackson 1828, Lincoln in 1860, 1932 FDR. And the one election that we just sort of look at as an anonymous thing, it's industrialism, populism, urbanism, currency question all clashing together, is 1896. And in reality, it's a fantastic story of one of the most adroit political figures to emerge on the American scene, and one of the remarkably today unknown figures. Nobody knows that this was a heroic figure in the Civil War. Received 3 battlefield promotions for unbelievable valor. Begins the war as a private, ends the war as a major. Having received battlefield promotions, survived 2 suicide missions, and becomes a adroit member of the United States Congress, a reform-minded governor of Ohio. Is losing the election in August of 1896, goes on to win it, and kicks off a 32-year period of Republican dominance of American politics, because the things that he said he would do in the campaign, he immediately did, and this realigned American politics. He becomes the first president in almost a quarter of a century to get more than 50% of the vote. He ends the broken politics of the Reconstruction.
Right, second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, the last quarter of the 19th century. And so I stumbled into it by accident, total accident.
From you as kind of the political strategist, understanding these elections and trends.
Yeah, I was really interested in Theodore Roosevelt in the election of 1896. Because he is completely, in 1895, he is the police commissioner, one of the members of the police commission of New York,
right.
Which he starts off thinking is fantastic. He dresses up and goes out at night to find sleeping policemen and so forth. But by 1896, he's in a battle with his fellow commissioners. They're suing each other in court. He places the wrong bet. He's on the wrong side of the Republican machine in New York, led by Thomas Collier Platt, the easy boss. And he has no way to ever get slated for office. And the only way to rescue his political career is to back somebody for president, get a job in Washington if they win. So he backs the front runner, Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine, who loses the nomination in an upset to William McKinley. And he writes a letter to his sister that I read that really got my attention. He writes a letter to his sister saying, we got a great gold plank in St. Louis, and McKinley is a good man, but he is weak, and I worry about him in a moment of crisis for our country. And a couple of days later, he writes one of McKinley's close personal friends and says, we must do everything we can to elect McKinley. And when is he elected? You must be the minister to France, or at least the secretary of the treasury, and my ambitions, such as they are, can go by the wayside.
Great impersonation here.
So, how in the heck, my question was, how in the heck did he get to where he was? Because without the election of 1896, without McKinley at the end of the campaign is pressured by the same guy that TR wrote the letter to make him the assistant secretary of the Navy, and he tells him, I'll consider it, but I do not trust your young man Roosevelt. He's too pugnacious. And yet somehow or another, he gets appointed, and with that history is set. If he had not been the assistant secretary of the Navy, we would probably have never heard of Theodore Roosevelt again.
Right.
He becomes the assistant secretary, famous order to Dewey, make steam, head for Manila. If the hostilities are declared and the Spanish fleet emerges, destroy them. I'm resigning to organize the first, volunteers, the Rough Riders. up Capitol Hill, I'm up San Juan Hill, I go home and I conduct a 5-week campaign, a 5-week-long campaign for the governorship of New York State in 1898, 5 weeks long. He's mustered out in late September and elected governor in the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
And that's fascinating. McKinley is known because assassination and Roosevelt.
And when he is assassinated, we experience grief like we have not experienced since the death of Abraham Lincoln, and will not experience again until the death, assassination of John Kennedy. 500,000 people line the railroad tracks between Buffalo and Washington, D.C. when he's laid to rest overnight in the East Room of the White House, where Confederate veterans guard his beloved casket of the beloved.
So let me ask you a question, move away from McKinley. Fascinating.
Yeah. Hell of a good read.
We got it.
Sex,
I'm holding it
violence,
up.
backstabbing, really cool names, everything you wanted, it's all true. Hell of a read.
So you don't mention, you end those kind of elections that really transform a paradigm shift in politics. Reagan's election in '80, would you count that? Or
I would, but the political scientists, for reasons that are beyond me, don't. But I do think it ends the New Deal alignment. I mean, the New Deal had Italians, and Irish, and working class, particularly blue-collar working class.
Yeah, Reagan Democrat.
The Reagan Democrat became the Reagan Republican. But I think there have been 6 realignment elections. Now, the realignment didn't last that long because we do have this extraordinary moment of, it doesn't apparently last that long,
right,
because we have this extraordinary moment of 1988 of getting a 3rd term. But then we have 1992. Now, my view, though, is that it's just like 1912, the Republican split, so was the Republican vote split in 1992 with Ross Perot. Bill Clinton gets the same percentage of the vote that Michael Dukakis had gotten 4 years earlier. So I think that the Reagan era, the Reagan realignment lasts through 2008.
So going to the policy associated, I mean, the New Deal era obviously had a certain set of views and policies that defined it. Reagan as well.
Right.
When Reagan was elected, you could basically say that was the end of the New Deal era. We just hit on that.
Right.
When, that was roughly 30, 40 years, right? From FDR to Carter.
Right.
Reagan till when? When does Reaganism, is it remain, or is it like the New Deal era in your mind we're experiencing its sunset?
I agree that it's an open question. I tend to think that it's not, because I think
Not the sunset?
Not the sunset.
Okay.
Because it's based around 2 things. One is the fear of the threat to freedom from modern government, from the modern state, as he said in his Westminster speech in 1982, and the threat of Soviet communism. Now, Soviet communism, Russia is dead.
Behind us.
But let's be clear, the Communist Party of China is coming on in many of the same ways and is a danger. Both of them are totalitarian regimes. We're seeing that played out, whether it's with the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong. There is a modern state that understands international public relations, but it is a threat to the freedom of the world. So those 2 things, I think, are still there, but they have to be redefined. You can't keep something that sort of crystallized between 1976 and 1980 and then played out over the next roughly 10 to 12 years and turn around and say, well, we've now jumped forward 20 some odd years. It's exactly the same.
Right. It rhymes, but it's, yeah. It's interesting you say 1976, because that's really when it began with Reagan's challenge forward. I mean, that's quite a significant moment, at least in the GOP, to have that contested a primary.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's yes, but also remember we have Ford who gets there by the simple fact he's the vice president he's appointed as the vice president to succeed a man who's indicted for corruption and then succeeds the president when the president is forced from office.
Bunch of asterisks there.
Yeah, a bunch of asterisks. Which is extraordinary to me is that the Republican Party was still unified enough that after 2 of those blows, Spiro Agnew's resignation and indictment, and Nixon's being forced from office rather than being impeached, that nonetheless Ford still hung on to the nomination and came within an eye whisker of winning the general election.
tells you something about the power of incumbency, right?
Sure.
It's really, so let's go from one incumbent to another, and we're of course right now in the midst of a presidential election. November is not too far off.
16 weeks.
There we go.
Not that anybody's counting.
Well, you wouldn't know.
17 days.
But and that's what you wrote in your most recent Wall Street Journal piece, that the days are numbered, you know, and you reminded the president of that. Just give me your sense of how unusual this is. What kind of anomaly this is in terms of a presidential election happening in the midst of this pandemic crisis.
Yeah, well, we've got three big ones. I mean, we have the pandemic, the economy, and then we have racial unrest. I mean, the closest you can come is we did have in 1968 civil unrest over civil rights and anti-war. But this thing has got, no president's had to deal with something like this. I mean, we've had presidents in wartime, we've had presidents in economic difficulty, we've had presidents facing insurrection and protests and riots, but we've got them all three.
It's trifecta.
Trifecta. And then we've got this extraordinary thing. I mean, give Joe Biden his due. This guy, he is the first Democrat to ever win the nomination of his party after losing Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada. It's the fourth contest. I can't find anybody that it took until the fourth contest for them to win and go on to win the nomination of their party.
Isn't that because everybody knew South Carolina was more reflective of where the Democratic Party was going to be?
I think that's correct. A majority of the votes are black, and it's not truly reflective of the Democratic Party, but it's dominated by a constituency, older black women in particular, who like to vote for a traditional Democrat, and given the choice between voting for the traditional Democrat, the guy who sort of looked like somebody that they've been brought up to believe represented the face of the party, and somebody who was far to the left.
Bernie Sanders.
They went for the traditional Democrat.
Yeah, and Congressman Clyburn.
Yeah.
And the congressman, the most prominent congressman, black congressman in South Carolina. I mean, he really impacted that, right? And that's classic. Almost, it's in the 21st century. It was kind of a 20th or even 19th century way of doing business.
Yeah, it was. And with all due deference to Congressman Clyburn, it also helped that Joe Biden was elected in the U.S. Senate in 1972. He had first declared for president in 1987. Had been Barack Obama's vice president, loyal vice president for 8 years, and cultivated people over the years. And look, say what you will about a lot of Joe Biden's shortcomings or strengths. One of his strengths is that he's a personable fellow, and he had made the most of those moments that he had with people over the years.
So you've said publicly that the president was behind Joe Biden, Trump behind Joe Biden.
Look, the last time he was tied in a poll, I think, was in March. And in all of this year, the president has been ahead of Biden in one poll. And we're talking about approaching 100 plus polls. So he's behind. You got to recognize that. You cannot solve a problem unless you recognize where you are. And the president's behind. Not fatally. Other presidents have been behind before. Obama was behind in 2012. We were behind in 2004. Harry S. Truman was behind at the end of August by nearly double digits. So you can recover, but you have to recognize where you are before you can.
So the problem isn't the polling.
No. Well, let me say, the problem is not the nationwide polling. I have enormous distrust of state level polls because national polls, they tend to be put together by organizations that we've got enough money to do it right, and we can also get a lot of them happen all the time, so we can sort of average them out and get a sense of what.
So sample sizes and frequency is lacking at state polling.
Yeah, and quality, the quality of just the organization that issues the poll. For example, in Iowa, the Des Moines Register uses a group called the Seltzer.
Okay.
They do a good job. Their polls in Michigan, I wouldn't use to blow my nose.
Well, that's a problem because Michigan, I don't know what you feel of the state polls in Wisconsin, but those are two states right there. Which
Wisconsin's got a good poll in the Marquette poll.
Marquette, that's right.
Again, I trust more several polls.
Right.
And I'm sure the campaign has got several of its own polls in those states, and it's got a better sense of where it is. But he's behind the Marquette poll, and there are other polls in other states that I trust.
One more.
If you're behind that, if you're behind by the Real Clear Politics average 9 points nationwide, then if a poll says you're behind, and if the polls that come out in Florida or Michigan or Pennsylvania say you're behind, you're likely to run.
Okay, so what about the closet Trump voter, the lying to the polls, the fact that the national polls, the perception is, got it wrong in 2016? What's your whiteboard response to that?
Well, first of all, I think there are some shy Trump voters because in the national polls, I think the final average was like 3 point something other lead for Hillary Clinton nationwide, and it was slightly less than that in popular vote. But all of the national polls, if you take a look at them, the vast preponderance of them were about where the election came out. The one poll that had Donald Trump winning, the LA Times poll, LA Times USC poll, is the poll that was furthest off from the actual result.
Huh.
It had Trump winning by a significant margin in the popular vote. And, but the others were right. It ended up that they were roughly in the vicinity. It was a 48-46 election. The polls overstated it by just over a third, 1 point. Right. Generally had her just over 3 points, and she won by just over 2 points. But they had it right.
Do you anticipate a similar type of election outcome with the popular vote and electoral college being in different places?
Well, it's only happened 5 times in American history. I doubt it's going to happen 2 times in a row. I think it's going to break one way or the other, and it could break for Trump, it could break against Trump for Biden.
But you don't see them being in different places. No. Is that just because it doesn't happen, or are you seeing something?
It's just a rarity. I mean, think about it. We have over 13 million votes cast in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Trump wins those 3 by 77,000 votes.
Yeah.
Out of 13 million plus. I mean, that's almost worthy of a little Dr. Evil. 13 million votes.
Right.
So, no, it could, but I don't think it's likely.
Do you think it's the same states though, where the contest will reside?
Well, I think Michigan.
Counties.
Well, yeah, but Michigan's tougher. Pennsylvania has got its own unique thing because Biden was
Scranton, right?
And also he as a senator from Delaware, he's like the 3rd senator from Pennsylvania. Wisconsin.
People from Delaware don't appreciate that.
Yeah.
All the listeners from Delaware.
Yeah, all 6 of you. The first state. Wisconsin, I think, is better territory for Trump. But no, there are going to be some other differences. This time around, Arizona is going to be a battleground. I think Ohio is going to be less of a battleground. I think Ohio, for a variety of reasons, is more likely to be in the Republican column and less contested.
Is that a function of the governor DeWine?
I think that's part of it, but I think also the state is in transition. If you look on the eastern side of the state, particularly the counties along the Ohio River, the shift between 2012 and 2016 is profound. Starting up in the northeast corner and running along the river, it's extraordinary. I mean, 20-point swings.
You do this all the time on TV. You write about it.
It's sad.
Here's the part. What's your weakest state? So you just described the geography and distribution of voting in Ohio. I've heard you do it in multiple states. Hawaii would get you. But that's not a hard one. It's all different.
I've been to vacation in Hawaii, and I literally went to see the Republican parts of the Big Island and the Republican parts of Oahu. It's like, I just wanted to see where the
It's a site. It's like where they reside.
Give me the district. I literally House district map.
Where's
the one Republican?
Was it nice to meet that person?
Yeah. And where are the Republicans on Oahu? Okay, they're over here. They're over there to the Diamondback, and they're on the north side of the island. I mean, it was sick. We figured out your vulnerability.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, the other one that I'm curious to get your take on is DC statehood. Big push now in DC. Any chance that ever changes?
I'm one of these people who believes since it's in the Constitution, you have to have a constitutional amendment. And if it ever gets serious, give it back. Give it to Maryland.
Give it to Maryland.
Yeah. No. Give it to Maryland. I think that you're, first of all, they'll try and do it legislatively because they know they can't do it constitutionally.
Well, of course, yeah.
But if ultimately, I think the founders were right about not wanting to have the people of the district that was the center of their government be treated the same as the states. But if you want to make sure that their vote is
There's a process for it.
Yeah, and if you want to give them representation in Congress, give them back to Maryland. They'll get one additional member of the House. But the idea that we're going to create 2 senators and 1 House member, I think, is anathema. It's pure politics.
So staying on the subject of proposals that would require constitutional changes, electoral college. You just said that you don't see it happening this go around.
It's never going to happen. Because look, think about it. Was it take 13 states to oppose it? North Dakota, South Dakota,
The same reasons unpopulated states.
Idaho, Montana, Delaware, Arkansas.
Never gonna go for it.
No.
And the view that it should be able to just do away with it outside of that constitutional process, of course, then it's institutional.
And look, it is one of the great advantages of our system. Anybody who said, you mentioned Swedish politics.
Yeah.
There are like 7 or 8 political parties in Sweden.
Coalition governments.
Yeah. Well, and think about how dysfunctional countries like Italy are because they lack a two-party system. Our two-party system was ironically not thought of by the founders, but it is the design that they put in place caused it to come into being, and it's been one of the great advantages of our system. It moderates the passions on the extremes. If a party gets too far out of the mainstream, the opposition wins. It has caused people to be active on behalf of great causes inside both major political parties, and it's given us a sense of stability that is rare in the Western world, and certainly in democracies in general. The Brits are the closest we have to it, and even there are.
Well, they've had the third party in Clegg, but social liberals. So you mentioned the two-party system,
Right.
And almost like a moderating force. I think I just heard you say. Some people are skeptical about that. That either the reality today is that the party actually doesn't play that role anymore. That it's really changed significantly than maybe even 10, 20, 30 years ago, and then specifically the GOP. What's your take on the future of the GOP and the importance of the GOP in Republican politics?
Yeah. Well, let's go back for a minute. Ironically, you're right. Political parties as institutions have become weaker, and partisan identification has become stronger, which is sort of ironic.
Yeah.
We feel more. We're Democrats and Republicans, and we feel more passionately about our connection with the party. At the same time, more power has been taken out of the party and transferred to interest groups and super PACs and campaigns of candidates themselves.
Right.
Sort of an irony. But look, I think both parties are are disrupted. They've both been disrupted by populist forces, and both of them are going through a period where they're trying to figure out how do we cope with the future. Because in a way, they've each had their successes. The Democratic Party has been a party of social liberalism and of civil rights. Both of those causes have seen great progress. The Republican Party is a party of limited government and strong national defense. Those two things, at least in terms of lip service, have received a lot. We're the party of markets and capitalism, and but we're now dealing with a different world. We're dealing with the world of the 21st century, and the question is, how do you take the timeless principles of both of these parties, in our case, Reaganite principles, and apply them to different circumstances that we find ourselves in?
So, answer that question. What does it look like, and what is the Trump kind of contribution to that? Whether it's a second term or if Joe Biden wins, what's the lasting legacy of Trump in that kind of 21st century?
Well, firstly, he is a populist. So, I mean, this is not a guy who read Von Mises. He thinks Von Mises is a lawn service company in New Jersey. Hayek is a butcher shop on the Upper East Side. So he's not a guy who, William M. Buckley, I think I met him at a social party, and he does a spectacular one. So, he's not a doctrinaire conservative. He's not, read deeply, imbibed deeply.
So, not establishment.
Well, no, he's not really a learned conservative. He has conservative instincts, and he has done some very good conservative things, whether it's judges or tax cuts or regulatory relief or energy sufficiency or national defense, even some elements of his foreign policy. But let's not kid ourselves. There's a Trump sentiment. There's not a Trump doctrine. There's not a cohesive worldview there. So some people will attempt to build on that. The Senator Hawleys and Senator Cottons, they will take some elements of it, whether it is populist distrust of big institutions, or in the case of Hawley, or concern about immigration policy in the case of Cotton, and they'll try and build on it. But that's what's going to be interesting about the Republican Party. Win or lose, the Republican Party is going to be thinking, there are going to be people talking about what comes next. People, if he wins, people are going to be saying, well, I want to be the nominee in 2024, and we'll have something that looks more Trumpy. If he loses, you know, all bets are off. Some people will say he was sui generis, nobody can, it largely was his persona, but, you know, and the policies, there are some good policies in there, but there's going to be a robust debate about the future of the party.
You use the word robust debate, whether he is reelected, and certainly if he's not elected. How bitter will that debate be?
I think that depends. It could be very bitter, and if it does, the only winners will be the Democrats. If he does lose, there are people who are going to sort of exalt, and Republicans who will exalt that he lost. I mean, we'll have people who are today raising money mostly from Democrats to spend on ads attacking him who will be happy. But I think the party would be well advised to sort of step back, take a moment, and say, okay, what is it that we need to do respectfully, make my case for doing this thing in order to advance our cause in the 2022 midterms would be the first test. Similarly, if he wins, you're still going to have people who in the 2022 election are going to try and say, here, I'm what comes next.
I'm the successor.
Right. I mean, look, let's be clear. The George Bush campaign in 1988 was not the Reagan campaign in 1980.
Right.
He gloried in the successes of the Reagan-Bush administration, but you have to say, I represent the third term of the vision, but I represent myself and my values and vision. This is, it's hard to win a third term. That's why Al Gore, who couldn't figure out who he was or what he represented, he couldn't even embrace the good things that the Clinton-Gore years had brought without, screwing it up.
So what piece of the Trump legacy has to go? What piece do you not see remaining in the GOP afterwards?
I think it's going to be hard to dominate social media in the way that he does. And I think that people are, even today, I run into
the presidential tweet will not be.
Well, the presidential tweet will be different. But what I see is I go around the country, and I travel a lot of people, because I'm on Fox, people sort of recognize me, they come up, and I love Donald Trump, and I like hearing what they have to say, so I'll say, oh, what do you like about him? Well, I like this, I like that. I say, how about the tweets? And then everybody, oh, God, I wish he'd say that. So even among his really strong advocates, they're sort of like, some of those things cause them to cringe.
Huh. Democratic side now.
Yeah.
So, first on the campaign, Joe Biden is not out there because of the pandemic.
That's been a big advantage. That has been a big advantage. As a result, there's been a hot white spotlight on Donald Trump. And if you have a national media that is as antagonistic to him as they are, he's never going to get a break. Now, this is why I think the campaign.
Isn't there a comeuppance though at some point?
I did. Well,
he needs to get on stage.
Right? He needs to get on the stage because what happens? I've been watching these little interviews he's been doing with like Miami Channel 5. Here he is in Ankeny, giving a satellite tour of Ankeny, Iowa. And they're dreadful. And what happens if he goes into a national debate and can't string together two sentences? He not only has had the advantage of being off the stage and largely invisible in his rec room in his basement, but remember the debates were all debates with 8 or 9 people.
Right.
So you have, let's say you got 8 people and you got 90 minutes. Do the math between you and the 2 or 3 or 4 questioners. You're going to get, a matter of 6 or 7 minutes. What happens when we have 90 minutes and 2 people in the spotlight for 3 national debates? And what could that do?
He's not going to be ready.
Well, here's the deal. I think it's a mistake for the Trump campaign to keep saying he's not going to be ready. Right. He can't string together consensus. That's something that I, as an observer and a commentator, can say. But frankly, if they're saying it, it's lowering the expectations. They ought to be raising it, in my opinion. They ought to be out there saying, well, we hear all of that, but you know what? Remember what he did to Paul Ryan in the 2012 debate. Remember what he did to Sarah Palin in the 2008 debate. Boy, he's an accomplished. He's been around for 50 years. He's got a lot of tricks up his sleeve. I'd be raising the expectations.
Are the debates really going to matter?
You know what? I think they will, but I don't know.
You would have said in previous elections that they do, right? It's generally where the school you come from.
Yeah. And they do. If Gerald Ford had not, if you take a look at the polls in 1976, if Gerald Ford had not said that the communists didn't dominate Eastern Europe, I suspect that line would have continued to go like this rather than flatline. And
so you had a lot to lose from a debate.
Yeah, and he lost from that debate. And Similarly, I think that Al Gore made a mistake when he made that sort of move to, sort of muscle out towards Bush.
Yeah.
And Bush looked at him, shook his head, laughed at him, and it was over.
That's right.
But that was like leading with your chin. Incidentally, we had been told that would happen.
Oh, the Bush campaign knew that
Rob Portman played the role of Al Gore in the debate.
which is his thing. He always plays the role. He's
And
very good at this
he
role.
had gone back and looked at all of the debates. Victor Ashe was the Republican mayor of Knoxville, and in Gore's last campaign for the U.S. Senate, Victor was his opponent, and they had 8 debates. And in every one of them, Gore just slashes poor Victor, who's a wonderful human being, was a great mayor, would have been a great senator, but he was not a debater. And Gore just lacerated him in every one of them. And more than a majority of them went over and sort of did to Victor, who's a relatively small guy, what he tried to do to Bush. And so Rob is saying, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. He said, nobody's that stupid, nobody's going to do that. But something was sort of implanted in Bush's head that this might happen.
So President Bush kind of
No, he did
ready for it.
Yeah, well, it was the right instinct, but he wasn't surprised by it. And of course, he gave the typical West Texas sort of like, what you doing over here, boy? and it was done. And because everybody saw it. I mean, and you saw the sort of big, looming, stern figure from partial visage of Gore. And then Bush is like, how you doing? And it was done.
Right, totally
But it was very funny that Portman had figured it out.
I mean, to me, just seeing Biden and Trump go up against each other, it has been great to me.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned my McKinnon book.
Yeah.
There is a lesson. The angry populace was William Jennings Bryan.
Right.
The guy who said, we're all in this together. We're in the midst of a terrible economic depression. And you're blaming it on my party's policy, the gold standard. And that guy over there, the Democrat, has said, I'm not responsible for it because I'm in favor of the silver standard. We're all in this together. We're going to rise or fall together. Capital and labor are going to succeed together or fail together. And we've got to find a way to come together as a country. And there are things that McKinley does to unify the country that, in essence, win him this tremendous victory. He's the first Republican presidential candidate to ever appeared with Confederate war veterans. Remember, he is a decorated war hero, and he invites 2,000 Confederate veterans from the campaign, the men on the other side of the guns who were trying to kill him, to come and visit him in Canton, Ohio. And a scene of blue and gray, walking up North Market Avenue with bands and flags flying. Every one of them wearing a badge, half gray, half blue, that says, no east, no south, no north, no west, but one country. People are weeping at this image of unity. So there is a lesson. My sense is that maybe not in this election, but the political tension in the country is going to be broken on behalf of the party that finds the language in an ongoing way to say, we're all in this together.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had a moment where we've been told to look up.
Right, that's right. And who was the guy who did that most powerfully?
That would be President Reagan.
President Reagan. I mean, that is the legacy of Reagan as a pod to the Republican Party and the conservative movement, is an optimistic and positive vision of the future. Yes, he was concerned about the Soviet threat, but he was able to talk about, yes, he was concerned about the threat of the modern state, but he was able to talk about these in ways that caused people to have hope and optimism that the future would be brighter. And what we forget is that the Westminster speech to me it was so impressive, because what is the first threat to modern society that he talks about? The threat of nuclear war.
Yeah.
He was a peacemaker, and the things that he was doing as president were designed to assure the prosperity and peace of not only our country but the world.
Here's some polling that surprised me when I got into this role. Because you're right, Reagan was optimistic,
Right.
Positive, also future-oriented.
Right.
His polling for the demographic between 18 and 30,
Yeah.
it's through the roof.
Yeah.
It's late in the second term, over 70 years old.
Yeah. And remember, he starts off with an advantage, because who is the guy who's saying we got to separate, we got to settle for less, we're
Carter, right?
It was Carter. And here was this guy who was optimistic and confident and believed in you, and a smile on his face. And it says something about the ability of a leader to find a way convey a message, and he did so. Lincoln, Lincoln galvanized public attention by telling stories.
Yeah.
And it was, and his were rough-hewn frontier humor. One of the things that gets me, I was preparing for this, and one of my favorite Reagan book.
There we go. We're in the lightning round.
There we go.
All right.
Reagan's Diary.
Yeah.
Reagan's Diary. Because it's just, first of all, you read it and you learn a lot about the psyche of it, and he is funny as hell. They're discussing sanctions on the Romanian government for human rights violations, and he's like, well, they're having meetings of going back and forth about this, and during one of the meetings, and somebody says, well, Gorbachev wants to come over and speak to the Congress, and the leaders in Congress, some of them wanted to come, and Reagan puts in his diary, they raised the issue, and I was okay with it. Seems like he's got seems like he has a lot of supporters in the Congress. That's to be expected. It's like, but there's those little funny moments that are just
So succinct.
Oh, so succinct.
By hand. I mean, it's an amazing thing.
In big moments, I stumbled on that one because I was looking. I wanted to go back and see how he responded how did he respond to the Brandenburg Gate speech?
Mm-hmm.
What is he puts it in one sentence. He talks about I had a lovely lunch with the president of and the mayor of it, and blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, tens of thousands of people turned out and heard my speech, and they seemed to like it. It was like, okay.
And people confuse that, particularly the left, for not having intellectual depth or clear, set of ideals.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, that's why I love the diary, because you sit there and say, the other one is Marty Anderson, who did a great thing by digging out the original handwritten script.
In his own head. Yeah.
Because everybody assumed, there was who was it back there who was writing those things? And it turns out it was him.
Years of work.
Years of work.
Well, we got a book. We were talking about a speech. Is there a favorite Reagan quote as we close out this discussion?
Well, no, there's so many good ones. And incidentally, my favorite speech is not Brandenburg or Point de Hoc, these are the boys.
Yeah.
Mine is the original. 1964.
Time for choosing.
Time for choosing, because it is raw Reagan. It's the young amateur coming up. It's
put him on the map.
Put him on the map. And one of the amazing things to me is, and I watched the tape several times. I was asked to write an article about it because somebody had heard that I was a big fan of it. and the opening of it is not that good. I mean, it's like he's running it, he's rushing it. It's 7 minutes into it before he ever mentions Goldwater's name. It's a 30-minute speech. And it's 7 minutes in, and he's clearly, they do the cutaway at about 4 minutes. They cut to the crowd, you can just tell they're sort of like looking at their fingernails and brushing their hair and stuff. But he tells a joke, and the crowd laughs and puts him at ease. But about 14 minutes into it, and he's giving this speech, and it's so fluid, and he's getting in, he's telling stories. He's, Rice County, Kansas. They say it's a depressed area. They got 140 oil wells and $30 million in the local banks, and people are laughing and so forth. And he's so fluid, and about 14 minutes in, you get a brief moment where the camera angles over his shoulder, and you realize, if you look closely, that he's delivering it off of 4x6 cards. Little 4x6 cards, and not a huge stack for 30 minutes, but like, a dozen or less. Right. And Marty Anderson, of course, was the one who shared the great story about he had this sort of weird hieroglyphics. He would write out his speech and put it on these cards himself, and he would have little symbols that meant things to him, and little numbers and little figures and key words and phrases. And he gave this incredibly fluid speech for 30 minutes, drawn from his own thoughts, his own values, his own views, and then written on these cards. And as you're right, that's
and you can draw a line from 1964 and those ideas through 1988.
That's right.
They're
still there. I mean, in the 1964 speech, what are the two big threats that America faces?
Totalitarianism, one, right?
Right, and the threat of the modern state.
Big government.
Communism and too much government.
Karl Rove, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, If your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.